we're a bit pessimistic about LATAM's ability to, I would say, get away from the pandemic bill that you see here on the page, right? And supply chain bottlenecks, by the way, is something affecting all regions, all countries. But if you think about other items here on this pandemic bill, right, we're looking at growing fiscal deficits. We need to remember that LATAM got into the pandemic already in a very fragile fiscal position in most countries. There's a lot of not just governments, but also companies that owe money in US dollars. And we've seen probably the sharpest depreciation across emerging market currencies in LATAM. Another B2B clients are very worried about the financial stability of their SMB or SME segment. So there's liquidity issues there. And then you also think about households, as you will see, right? Peruvians and Chileans, they tapped into the savings probably too much. That could compromise long-term consumption. And then the countries that did not tap into their savings, they did tap into credit. And that's problematic when consumers were already on a lot of debt and interest rates are actually rising. And then we've seen actually pretty weak labor recovery. So this is obviously concerning as you think about the pace of withdrawal of stimulus into the next few months. And on top of this, you have pandemic fatigue and rising social anxiety, which is not exclusive to COVID-19. It was already under the surface in LATAM. If you think about the Chile protests in 2019 and all the protests that we saw in other countries prior to the pandemic. So we're definitely worried about this. Now, if you're planning for 2022, our view is actually much more optimistic. And I'll explain you why in a minute, but we need to first understand that there's still many countries that have not recovered pre-pandemic levels in 2021. So if you think about the growth rates for 2022, they should reflect that ongoing rebound in the numbers, and you can see the growth numbers here on the right. You think about Chile, Colombia, Brazil, those have already recovered pre-pandemic levels, so they should revert more quickly to historical growth rates, or at least the ones that they had prior to the pandemic. But if you think about the actual factors behind the growth rates, all of them are cyclical and are pointing to the right direction. So I'm going to be talking about this in a minute, but we have high vaccination rates, allowing for more sustainable reopening that will boost investment into services and intern employment. As I said, we have reasons to believe that governments will continue to spend money in 2022 for political and social reasons. And then monetary policy and export growth, I would say commodity prices, even though they're going to be worsening in relation to this year's levels, they're still going to be supportive of growth. So what I'll do, Ana Maria, right now is to unpack each of these factors one at a time, starting with vaccination. And I would say the vaccination story for LATAM, I think it's been a success. I know that many Latin Americans were frustrated at the beginning of the year because they just didn't see vaccination taking off the ground. But if you compare LATAM to other emerging countries, especially in Asia, we're actually in a much better place. And even against some of the developed countries, and I don't know if you saw that Brazil already surpassed the US last week in terms of the percentage of population that receive at least one dose. And we have already 3 countries that are about 40% of full vaccination, Uruguay and Chile around 70% full vaccination. And the evolution of vaccination has not been linear, it's been exponential. And if you actually project, Ana Maria, the pace of vaccination that we had over the past 7 days into the future, right? So no acceleration, no deceleration. You will see that the smaller countries are they're actually well positioned to get to 80% of full vaccinations already in September, October, November of this year. And then the rest of the countries, January through March of next year, right? So we should be out of the woods, at least when it comes to vaccination, the current efforts of vaccination by Q1 of 2022. And if you're wondering, well, what happens with new variants, we're going to be talking about Delta in a minute. But it's important to understand that the way governments have reacted to the pandemic in terms of social distancing measures has not been consistent with the severity of the pandemic, right? At the beginning of 2020, right, when we got the first waves, we didn't understand very well how to control the pandemic, and most countries in Latin really try hard to control it. That didn't work out as we were expecting. And if you think about 2021, the severity of the pandemic has been worse. I mean, more people have died in 2021 than in 2020. But nonetheless, the level of stringency of social distancing measures actually went down in 2021. Right? So this already tells you the change in priorities, both by the government and also by the population, really prioritizing economic reactivation over the pandemic itself or the number of deaths. So it's important to bear in mind. Then the last thing that I would say were two more things that I would say here in terms of about COVID-19 is some clients might be wondering, well, Chile is at 70%, but it didn't really prevent the last outbreak that they had. And that's true, but if you look at Chile, back 2 months ago, more than 60% of the inoculations had been with Sinovac. And there's proof that Sinovac was just less effective than the other vaccines, especially the mRNA vaccines, Pfizer and Moderna. But if you look at what not only Chile, but the rest of the countries in LATAM are doing in terms of their vaccine procurement efforts, they're actually diversifying away from the Chinese vaccines into the Western vaccines. So as you continue vaccinating, the overall efficacy of the vaccination campaign is just going to go up. And on top of this, there's some countries already talking about booster shots, like Chile and Brazil already talking about it. And finally, when it comes to Delta, I don't want to underplay the severity of this variant, but I would say how quickly it spreads, how more quickly it spreads. But I'm actually more optimistic than what you read in the press. And here, the way I show this is, here you have 4 countries where Delta dominates. And these 4 charts are ordered from high to low vaccination, right? So the UK already at 60% of full vaccination. And you see here, yes, the number of deaths per million went up with Delta, but the level of deaths is negligible in relation to the worst moments of the pandemic. In the US, we're also seeing new waves and more people going to the hospital. That we know that most of the people that are being hospitalized or dying from the pandemic, unfortunately, are people who chose not to get vaccinated. And then in Mexico and Russia, you see obviously greater impact, but I want to bring to your attention that in Mexico, only 20% of Mexicans have been fully vaccinated, and in Russia is less than 20%, right? So the hope is once you get that to that 50, 60% threshold, you're gonna be protected against Delta. Now, can we say for certain that we're gonna be out of the woods for sure in 2022? Obviously, I'm not an epidemiologist, and there's new variants. I think there's one new variant that has been identified in Colombia. We have the Lambda variant. Really, the risk is for not necessarily a variant that spreads more quickly, but a variant that is more lethal, and that circumvents the vaccines that we have right now. But that hasn't been the case, right? We've seen lower efficacy, but the vaccines seem to work or seem to be better than not being vaccinated. So this is why we're actually optimistic about our 2022 outlook.